In the spring of 1861, America tore itself apart. What had begun as political disagreements over slavery and states' rights erupted into the bloodiest conflict in our nation's history. But this wasn't just a war between North and South, between states, or ideologies. This was a war that split families down the middle, turning brother against brother, father against son, friend against friend. It was a conflict so deeply personal that it would leave scars on American families for generations to come.
The tragedy of the Civil War wasn't just measured in battlefield casualties or destroyed cities. It was measured in the anguish of families forced to choose sides, in the heartbreak of mothers who watched their sons march off to fight each other, in the impossible decisions that ordinary Americans faced when their country divided. This is the story of those families, those brothers, those friends who found themselves on opposite sides of the greatest conflict in American history. Consider the Crittenden family of Kentucky. Senator John Crittenden had spent his career trying to prevent the very war that would tear his own family apart. His son Thomas became a general in the Union Army, fighting to preserve the United States. His other son George became a general in the Confederate Army, fighting for Southern independence. Two brothers, raised in the same house, taught the same values, now commanding armies that would try to destroy each other. When people asked Senator Crittenden how he could bear having sons on both sides, he replied that he prayed every night that they would never meet on the battlefield. The McCook family of Ohio sent 17 men to war. 14 fought for the Union, but 3 cousins joined the Confederate cause. The family was so prominent in the Union Army that they were known as the Fighting McCooks. Yet even they couldn't escape the divisions that split American families. At family gatherings before the war, the McCook men had debated politics and slavery with passion but civility. Now, those same arguments were being settled with bullets and bayonets.
In Missouri, the Anderson family experienced perhaps the most tragic division of all. One brother, William Anderson, became the notorious Confederate guerrilla fighter known as Bloody Bill, leading raids that terrorized Union supporters. His tactics were so brutal that even other Confederate commanders distanced themselves from him. Meanwhile, his brother served with Union forces, hunting the very guerrillas that his sibling led. The Anderson brothers had grown up together, shared the same childhood, but the war had turned them into mortal enemies.
The bonds of friendship proved just as fragile as family ties. At West Point Military Academy, young men from across the nation formed lifelong friendships, bound together by the shared trials of military training. They studied together, suffered through harsh discipline together, and swore oaths of loyalty to their country together. But when the war came, these friendships shattered along sectional lines. Robert E. Lee and Winfield Scott had been close friends and colleagues for decades. Lee had served under Scott in the Mexican War, and Scott had recommended Lee for important commands. But when Virginia seceded, Lee chose his state over his country, and Scott chose the Union over their friendship. Ulysses S. Grant and James Longstreet had been roommates at West Point and close friends throughout their Army careers. They had served together in the Mexican War and supported each other through difficult times. Longstreet had even been best man at Grant's wedding. But when the Civil War began, Longstreet resigned his commission to join the Confederacy, while Grant remained loyal to the Union. 4 years later, at Appomattox Courthouse, Grant would accept Longstreet's surrender as Lee's army laid down its arms. The two old friends met with tears in their eyes, remembering better days when they had fought side by side instead of against each other. The horror of brother fighting brother was never more evident than at the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. Confederate General Lewis Armistead led his brigade in the doomed assault known as Pickett's Charge. As he advanced across that deadly field, he knew that commanding the Union artillery on Cemetery Ridge was his dear friend Winfield Scott Hancock. Armistead and Hancock had served together for years before the war, and their families had been close. When Armistead fell mortally wounded just yards from Hancock's position, he sent word to his old friend, asking Hancock to tell his family that he had died thinking of them. Hancock, himself wounded in the same battle, wept when he received the message.
The Civil War created impossible choices for families living in border states. Kentucky officially remained neutral, but its citizens fought on both sides. Families in Missouri, Maryland, and Tennessee found themselves divided not by geography, but by conscience and conviction. The Todd family of Kentucky exemplified this division. Mary Todd Lincoln, the president's wife, had 4 brothers who fought for the Confederacy. While she lived in the White House, her own brothers were fighting to destroy the government her husband led. When 3 of her brothers died fighting for the South, Mary Lincoln mourned them privately, unable to grieve publicly for men who had died as enemies of her husband's cause.
The Johnson family of Virginia faced an even more wrenching decision. When Virginia seceded, most of the family supported the Confederate cause. But young William Johnson believed that the Union must be preserved at all costs. He joined the Union Army and found himself fighting in battles that took place on his own family's land. At the Battle of Antietam, he fought against Confederate units that included his own cousins. When he returned home after the war, some family members refused to speak to him, considering him a traitor to his homeland. The psychological toll of these divisions was immense. Soldiers on both sides wrote letters home describing the anguish of recognizing familiar faces among enemy prisoners or casualties. Confederate soldier John Eston Cook wrote to his sister about capturing Union soldiers from his own hometown, men he had grown up with and considered friends. He described the awkwardness of guarding boys he had played with as a child, the painful silence when they recognized each other, the mutual shame of their situation. Union Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., who would later become a Supreme Court justice, wrote about the moral complexity of the war after encountering wounded Confederate soldiers who reminded him of his own brothers. He questioned whether the causes they fought for were worth the destruction of American families, whether any political principle justified turning neighbors into enemies. Yet he continued to fight, as did millions of others, because they believed their cause was just. The war created heartbreaking scenes in hospitals and prisoner of war camps. Confederate nurse Kate Cumming wrote about treating wounded Union soldiers who spoke with the same accent as her own brothers, who reminded her of the boys she had grown up with in Alabama.
She described the difficulty of caring for men who were officially her enemies, but who seemed like lost children, calling for their mothers. Union nurse Clara Barton had similar experiences, writing about Confederate prisoners who broke down when she spoke to them with kindness, homesick boys who hadn't seen their families in years.
The divisions created by the Civil War extended beyond the immediate families of soldiers. Churches split along sectional lines, with northern and southern branches of the same denominations condemning each other from their pulpits. Communities that had been united for generations found themselves divided by suspicion and hatred. In border areas, neighbor turned against neighbor, and the war became a deeply personal conflict fought not just on distant battlefields, but in communities and homes. The reunification of families after the war was often as difficult as their division during it. Brothers who had fought on opposite sides struggled to rebuild relationships damaged by 4 years of war. Some families never fully healed from the divisions created by the conflict. Others found that the shared experience of loss and suffering had created new bonds of understanding. The Crittenden brothers, Thomas and George, managed to reconcile after the war, but their relationship was never the same. They had seen too much, lost too much, and hurt too much to simply return to the innocence of their pre-war brotherhood. The Civil War's legacy of brother fighting brother left deep scars on American families and communities.
It demonstrated that even the strongest bonds of kinship and friendship could be broken by political and moral convictions. It showed that ordinary people, when faced with what they believed were fundamental questions of right and wrong, would sacrifice everything, even their closest relationships, for their principles. But perhaps the most important lesson of these brother versus brother battles is that the war's end brought not just victory for one side, but the possibility of healing for all. The same Americans who had fought each other with such ferocity proved capable of remarkable forgiveness and reconciliation. Former enemies became friends again, divided families reunited, and a nation that had nearly destroyed itself found the strength to rebuild together. The Civil War reminded us that Americans are capable of both great division and great unity, that we can be torn apart by our differences, but also brought together by our shared values and common humanity. The brothers who fought each other in that great conflict left us a legacy not just of war, but of the possibility of peace, not just of division, but of the hope of reunion.